Australia is not just a country. It feels like a world set apart. It is almost as large as the United States, but much of it remains nearly empty. Not empty in the simple sense, empty in the old, unsettling sense. The kind of vastness that makes people feel small again. Beyond the coastlines and major cities lies another Australia, a harder one, a quieter one, an Australia of red earth, burning light, dust storms, and distances so long they almost stop feeling real. Out there, a town can survive on one pub, one dirt airstrip, and one delivery truck that may not come soon enough. Out there, people do not measure life in convenience. They measure it in water, fuel, weather, and patience. And yet people stay. They stay in places where summer can feel brutal, where help may be hundreds of miles away, where silence is not peaceful every day. Sometimes it is the price of freedom. So in this film, we travel deep into the Australian Outback to see 10 of the most remote places in the country. Not abandoned places, not ruins, but real communities, weather stations, road stops, mining towns, and desert outposts where life still goes on. Some are strange, some are beautiful. Some feel almost impossible. But together, they reveal something essential about Australia, and maybe about people everywhere. Because the farther you go from comfort, the more clearly you see what humans are really made of. Coober Pedy, the town that went underground. At first glance, Coober Pedy does not look like a town at all. It looks like the aftermath of something ancient and violent. The ground is pale, broken, and full of scars. Dust hangs over the horizon. Mounds of earth rise everywhere. Thin metal vents stick out of the desert floor like pipes from a buried machine. And for a moment, you do not feel as if you are in Australia. You feel as if you have landed on another planet. But this is Coober Pedy in South Australia, one of the strangest working towns in the outback. Opal was discovered here in 1915. What followed was not just a mining camp, but an entire way of life shaped by heat, distance, and bare survival. The place became known as the opal capital of the world, and even today, opal remains central to its identity. The real story, though, is not only what people found here, it is how they learned to stay. Summer heat in this part of Australia can be brutal, so instead of fighting the desert from above, people went below it. They carved homes into the rock. Not bunkers, not shelters, real homes. Bedrooms, kitchens, churches, hotel rooms, even entire living spaces hidden beneath the surface. In these dugouts, the temperature stays remarkably steady, usually around 73 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the world above is burning. That is what makes Coober Pedy feel so unforgettable. It is not simply remote, it is adaptive. Most towns are built by imposing order on the land. Coober Pedy survives by yielding to it. The desert sets the terms, and people answer by disappearing into the earth. What began as a practical response to heat slowly became the town's defining character. In Coober Pedy, going underground is not an emergency measure. It is architecture. It is local wisdom. It is everyday life. Even the name carries that history. Coober Pedy comes from an Aboriginal term commonly translated as white man in a hole, a phrase that sounds almost blunt in its honesty. And honestly, it fits. This is a place where fortune seekers came to dig for color in a landscape that, from a distance, seems drained of all color. There is almost no softness here, very little shade, very little water. The town's water has long depended on engineered supply, not natural abundance. And yet life continues in this harsh, sun-struck emptiness with a stubbornness that feels distinctly Australian. So Coober Pedy is not memorable because it is weird. It is memorable because it reveals something deeper. When the surface becomes too hard to live on, human beings do what they have always done. They adapt. They improvise. They build a home anyway. And in this desert town, that home just happens to be underground. Birdsville, the outpost at the edge of the desert. Birdsville does not feel like the kind of place a town should exist. It feels like the last stop before the land gives up on people altogether. Out here at the far end of the Birdsville track, the world opens into something harsher and older. Birdsville sits beside the eastern edge of the Simpson Desert, with stony plains to the south and Channel Country to the north. It is not just remote, it is surrounded by distances that seem designed to test your resolve. And yet Birdsville has never been only a dot on the map. It has always been a threshold, a frontier town, a place where journeys pause, where supplies are counted, where the desert begins to feel less like scenery and more like a force. At the center of that life stands the Birdsville Hotel. Built in 1884, it is more than a pub in any ordinary sense. In a place this isolated, it becomes the social anchor, the meeting point, the keeper of news, memory, and routine. If Birdsville has a beating heart, it is here. That is what makes Birdsville so compelling for an American audience. It has some of the mythology of the Old West, but stripped down even further. No grand Main Street, no illusion of abundance, just heat, dust, enormous sky, and one outpost that keeps the human story going anyway. Then, once a year, the silence breaks. The Birdsville races transform this tiny desert settlement into one of the most famous event towns in the Australian Outback. The official race organizers call it a legendary Outback race meet, and even the tourism boards frame it as one of the defining experiences of Birdsville. For a brief stretch, this hard little town turns festive, crowded, and electric. Then the visitors leave, and the desert takes back the silence. That contrast is the real power of Birdsville. For most of the year, it lives on endurance. Then suddenly, it becomes a celebration. Not because the land has softened, but because people have learned how to build joy in a place that offers no easy comfort. So Birdsville is not memorable just because it is far away. It matters because it shows what remoteness does to a community when people choose not to run from it. It strips life down to essentials: a road, a hotel, a few stubborn routines, a yearly gathering, and beyond all of it, the red immensity of the desert. In Birdsville, survival is never abstract, but neither is belonging. And that may be why places like this stay with people long after they leave. Wittenoom, the town Australia tried to erase. There are remote towns in Australia, and then there is Wittenoom. Because Wittenoom is not memorable for the usual outback reasons, not for its beauty, not for its endurance, not even for its isolation alone. It stands apart because this is one of the rare places where remoteness turned into a warning. In the original transcript, it is framed not just as a ghost town, but as a place the government tried to remove from public memory altogether. Wittenoom was once a blue asbestos mining town in Western Australia. Mining ended in 1966, and the state began winding the town down in 1978 because of the danger posed by airborne asbestos fibers. By December 2006, the government had removed the town's official status and cut the power grid. In June 2007, the town site was officially de-gazetted, and its name was removed from official maps and road signs. In 2008, it was formally classified as a contaminated site. That history gives Wittenoom a different emotional weight from the other places in this film. Most remote settlements feel like acts of defiance against nature. Wittenoom feels like a reckoning. Official Western Australian sources say asbestos remnants from past mining operations have already caused thousands of fatalities among miners, residents, and visitors. The contamination is still so severe that the current Wittenoom asbestos management area is described by the state as unsafe for any form of human occupation or land use, and it should not be visited. So what remains is not a living town in the usual sense. It is the outline of one. A place where roads once led to homes, and homes led to ordinary lives. And ordinary lives were slowly overtaken by an invisible dust people did not fully understand until it was too late. That is what makes Wittenoom so unsettling for an American audience too. It does not feel like ancient tragedy. It feels modern, industrial, preventable, and therefore harder to shake. Even now, the story is not entirely over. The last residents were forced out after the Wittenoom closure bill became law in 2022, and demolition began in 2023. ABC reported in 2024 that it is illegal to visit the town, while the government continues warning people to stay away because asbestos fibers can still be disturbed by walking or driving through the area. And that is why Wittenoom matters in this journey. It shows a darker side of isolation. Sometimes a place is remote because nature made it hard to reach. Sometimes a place becomes remote because history made it too dangerous to remain. Wittenoom is not the romance of the Outback. It is the cost. A town that once promised work, purpose, and permanence, and now survives mostly as a cautionary silence in the red dust. Eucla, the town the sand keeps taking back. Eucla feels less like a town than a fading edge of the world. It sits near the Western Australia-South Australia border, along the Nullarbor, in one of the most isolated stretches of road on the continent. Tourism, Western Australia describes it as an isolated stop about 10 minutes from the South Australian border and roughly 1,430 kilometers from Perth by road. What makes Eucla unforgettable, though, is not only the distance, it is the sense that the land is slowly erasing what people built there. The old Eucla telegraph station was established in 1877 as a manual repeater station for the overland telegraph. In its time, it helped tie this remote frontier to the rest of Australia and the wider world. Today, the ruins sit in stark white dunes south of the town, and much of the original settlement has already been swallowed by sand. Tourism Western Australia says the dunes encroached after rabbits destroyed much of the vegetation that once held them back. That image gives Eucla its power. In many remote places, time leaves ruins behind. In Eucla, the wind keeps moving, and the landscape keeps burying them. You can still see the old stone walls, but they no longer feel permanent. They feel borrowed, as if the desert only allowed them to remain for a little while longer. Local tourism describes the station as a piece of history being swallowed slowly by its sandy surroundings, and warns in effect that it will not be there forever. For an American audience, Eucla has the pull of a vanished frontier town, but with a harsher twist. Not a place destroyed by war or fire, a place undone by exposure, distance, and the patient force of nature. That is why Eucla stays with people. It stands on the Nullarbor as both a stopover and a reminder. A reminder that even important places can become fragile when they are pushed to the edge of the inhabitable world. The same Eyre highway that now carries travelers across the Nullarbor passes the historic station as part of one of Australia's great long-distance drives. So Eucla is not dramatic in the loud sense. It is dramatic in the slow sense. A few buildings, a strip of highway, a horizon that seems endless, and below it all, the quiet certainty that the sand will keep moving long after people are gone. Innamincka, where the Outback remembers the dead. Some places feel remote because they are far away. Innamincka feels remote because history never really left. Deep in the far northeast of South Australia, Innamincka sits beside Coober Creek inside a vast reserve of red dunes, stony desert, wetlands, and flood country. South Australia's Park Service describes the area as a place of sharp contrasts, where the life-giving Coober Creek system meets the stark, arid outback. It lies more than 800 kilometers northeast of Adelaide, along the Strzelecki Track. That setting alone would make it memorable. But Innamincka carries something heavier than scenery. This is one of the places most closely tied to the Burke and Wills expedition, one of the most tragic stories in Australian exploration. South Australia's heritage authorities say the Innamincka Cooper Creek area is historically associated with the expedition of 1860 to 1863. The nearby Burke's Grave campground marks the final resting place of Robert O'Hara Burke, and the wider Cooper Creek area still holds the dig tree and other sites connected to the journey. And that matters for the way Innamincka feels. Because this is not frontier history in the romantic sense. It is frontier history in the unforgiving sense. A place that reminds you very quickly that courage is not always enough. Distance is real. Heat is real. Water is everything. And a map can promise far more than a landscape will ever give. What makes Innamincka so striking, though, is that life did not end with the legend. It continued. Today, the town remains a tiny outback outpost with basic services built around travelers, station country, and the communities that still move through this immense region. The Innamincka Hotel and the Innamincka Trading Post remain essential anchors for visitors and locals alike, offering accommodation, food, fuel, and supplies in a place where the next option may be a very long way away. That is where the American viewer may feel the real pull of Innamincka. It has the emotional shape of a Western, but without the mythology polished clean. It is rougher than that, lonelier, more honest. And the isolation here is not constant in one simple form. Sometimes the danger is drought. Sometimes it is the opposite. South Australia's Outback Road Service warns travelers to monitor road conditions, rainfall, and flood warnings before entering the region. And in April 2025, ABC reported that floodwater flowing down Cooper Creek cut Innamincka off by road, with concern the town could remain isolated for weeks or even months. That detail says almost everything about life here. Innamincka is not just far from the world. At times, the world can be shut out altogether. So this town endures in a different way from Coober Pedy or Birdsville. It does not survive by spectacle. It survives by memory, preparation, and mutual reliance. A pub, a trading post, a few supplies, a creek that can either sustain life or cut it off. And all around it, the immense stillness of the outback. Innamincka is where exploration, hardship, and ordinary life still meet in the same patch of dust. And that is why it lingers in the mind. Not as a place that defeated the desert, but as a place that learned, generation after generation, how to live with what the desert allows. Marble Bar, the town that learned to live inside an oven. In some places, heat is part of the background. In Marble Bar, it becomes the main character. Deep in Western Australia's Pilbara, Marble Bar has long been known as Australia's hottest town. Tourism, Western Australia still presents it that way today, and the old claim is rooted in one of the country's most famous weather records. Between October 31st, 1923 and April 7th, 1924, the town recorded 160 consecutive days at or above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 37.8 degrees Celsius, a national record confirmed by Australia's Bureau of Meteorology. That number matters because it is almost hard to imagine in ordinary human terms. A few hot days can feel draining. A hot week can feel oppressive. But 160 straight days over 100 degrees is something else entirely. It is like living beside an open furnace and calling it normal. And yet Marble Bar did not become famous only because it is hot. It became memorable because people stayed anyway. The town grew during the Pilbara Gold Rush and still carries that frontier character in its old buildings, small population, and weather-beaten sense of endurance. Western Australia's tourism site describes it as a pioneer history hotspot, while the Marble Bar Heritage Trail preserves the remains of that early remote settlement life. That gives Marble Bar a different emotional tone from the other places in this film. Coober Pedy adapted by going underground. Birdsville survived at the edge of the desert, but Marble Bar confronts the climate almost in plain sight. It is not buried, hidden, or half erased. It is simply exposed. Exposed to a sky that, for much of the hot season, seems to press down without mercy. And still, the story is not just brutality. That is what makes the place more interesting than a weather statistic. Even in Marble Bar, people have always found small forms of relief and routine. Tourism Western Australia points visitors toward the Kungun River and Marble Bar Pool as a kind of oasis, a place of water and shade in a landscape otherwise defined by radiant stone, dry heat, and distance. The contrast matters. In the Pilbara, survival is often about knowing exactly where the softness is hidden. For an American audience, Marble Bar can feel almost biblical in scale, not because it is grand in the postcard sense, but because it reduces life to essentials: shade, water, timing, endurance. The town reminds you that weather is not always something people complain about. Sometimes it is the central fact around which everything else must be organized. So Marble Bar is not just the hottest town. That phrase is true, but it is too small. What makes Marble Bar unforgettable is the human choice inside the record. To keep building, to keep serving drinks, to keep opening the store, to keep raising families and marking time in a place where summer does not merely arrive, it settles over the town like a test. And maybe that is the deeper truth of Marble Bar. The heat is the headline, but endurance is the story. Giles Weather Station, the outpost that watches the sky. Not every remote place is built around gold, fuel, or survival. Some are built around information. Giles Weather Station sits on the Great Central Road, on the edge of the Gibson Desert in Western Australia. It was established in 1956, and today it remains open as a Bureau of Meteorology site. Its official climate record listed at 25.03 degrees south, 128.30 degrees east, at an elevation of 598 meters. That may sound technical, but out here, technical work becomes something almost existential. Tourism. Western Australia describes Giles as a small but pivotal meteorological outpost. It says the station was originally created to support weapons and rocket testing, and that today observers still work there on 6-month rotations. The same source notes that it is near the subtropical jet stream, which helps explain why the station matters far beyond the desert around it. For an American audience, Giles feels less like a town and more like a frontier laboratory. There is no illusion of abundance here, no real urban buffer, just a few people, a narrow strip of infrastructure, and a sky so large it almost seems to press down on the station itself. And yet the work done here reaches far beyond this lonely patch of red earth. The Bureau says Giles is part of the worldwide network of stations that launch weather balloons twice a day. Those balloon observations measure temperature, pressure, humidity, wind speed, and wind direction high in the atmosphere. According to Bureau staff, data from Giles is crucial for forecasts and warnings across much of Australia, especially for rain and severe summer storms. That gives Giles a very different emotional tone from the other places in this film. Coober Pedy went underground to escape the heat. Birdsville held on at the edge of the desert. But Giles exists to observe, to measure, to keep watching the sky when almost nothing else is there. There is something quietly powerful about that. In a landscape that can seem empty, people still built a place devoted not to extraction, but to understanding. A place where the daily routine is not digging, hauling, or racing, but gathering invisible data that helps explain how the atmosphere is moving over an entire continent. Even its isolation is striking. Tourism Western Australia calls Giles Australia's most visited weather station, despite being the only staff station within 2.5 million square kilometers. The nearby community of Rawlinna is about 5 kilometers away, but the broader impression remains the same. This is a scientific outpost surrounded by immense silence. So Giles Weather Station is not dramatic in the usual Outback way. It does not rely on myth, ruins, or frontier legend. Its drama comes from purpose. A few people stand in the desert. They release balloons into the morning sky. They measure what cannot be seen. And from that lonely work comes knowledge that helps millions of others prepare for what is coming. That is what makes Giles unforgettable. Not just that it is far away, but that even this far away, someone is still watching, recording, and trying to understand the sky above us all. William Creek, the tiny stop before the great emptiness. William Creek is so small that in another country, it might barely count as a town at all. South Australia's tourism board says it has a permanent population of just 6 people. And yet this tiny settlement sits on one of the most storied remote roads in the country, the Oodnadatta Track. It is also described as the closest town to Kati Thanda, Lake Eyre, which immediately gives it a larger meaning than its size would suggest. That is what makes William Creek so compelling. It does not dominate the landscape. It almost disappears into it. But in the Australian Outback, places like this matter precisely because they are small. They become fuel stop, shelter, meal, rumor, airstrip, and reassurance all at once. Eyre says William Creek has the only petrol station between Maree, Coober Pedy, and Oodnadatta on the Oodnadatta Track, which tells you everything about how isolated this place really is. At the center of town is the William Creek Hotel, established in 1887. South Australia describes it as an iconic outback hotel and explicitly calls it the gateway to Kati Thanda, Lake Eyre, and the Anna Creek Painted Hills. That phrase matters, because William Creek is not memorable for what it contains. It is memorable for what it opens onto. And what it opens onto is extraordinary. Kati Thanda, Lake Eyre, is Australia's largest salt lake, and the national park lies about 60 kilometers east of William Creek. When floodwaters arrive, this immense basin can transform from blinding salt and silence into a place alive with water birds and shimmering reflections. When it is dry, it feels almost lunar. Either way, it is one of those landscapes that seems too large for ordinary human scale, which is exactly why William Creek feels so important as a threshold. For an American audience, William Creek has the emotional role of an old frontier outpost. Not dramatic in itself, but essential because it stands between settled life and something far bigger, harsher, and stranger. It is the kind of place where travelers stop, refuel, look around, and realize that from here on, the land is in charge. That feeling is reinforced by the way South Australia and local operators present William Creek today as the jumping-off point for scenic flights over Lake Eyre and the Painted Hills, places that are best understood from the air because the landscape is simply too vast to grasp from the ground. So William Creek is not just a tiny town on a dirt track. It is a reminder that in the Outback, scale changes everything. A hotel becomes an institution. A fuel pump becomes security. A settlement of 6 people becomes the front door to one of the most immense landscapes in Australia. And maybe that is why William Creek lingers in the mind, because it shows how little a place needs in order to matter, as long as it stands at the edge of something unforgettable. Rawlinna, where a sheep station becomes its own world. Rawlinna makes most remote towns look small in a different way, because Rawlinna is not memorable for a skyline or a main street or even a town center in the usual sense. It is memorable because scale takes over everything. Set out on the Nullarbor in Western Australia, Rawlinna sits beside the Trans-Australian Railway and along the edge of a sheep property so vast it is described by its current owners as the world's largest operating sheep station, roughly the size of Sydney. That changes the feeling of the place immediately. In most of the locations in this film, isolation comes from distance. In Rawlinna, it also comes from acreage. The land stretches so far that ordinary human measurements start to feel useless. According to CPC, Rawlinna Station lies about 400 kilometers east of Kalgoorlie and spans part of the Nullarbor Plain, where the country shifts from red dirt into pale limestone and hardy scrub. And yet this immense pastoral world is not cut off from motion entirely. One of the most striking details about Rawlinna is that the Indian Pacific still turns it into a living waypoint on Australia's transcontinental rail line. Journey Beyond says the train's Sydney to Perth itinerary includes an off-train experience in Rawlinna, with a signature dinner at the fringe of Australia's largest sheep station under the Outback stars. Tourism Australia describes it in similar terms: a remote outpost surrounded by vast sheep country where the nearest major town is more than 400 kilometers away. That contrast is what gives Rawlinna its character. It is both enormous and minimal, a place built around one of the biggest sheep operations in the country, yet still so isolated that a passing train feels almost ceremonial. For an American audience, it has the emotional shape of a frontier rail stop, but magnified to an almost surreal degree. Not just ranch land, a ranching landscape so large it begins to feel like its own private continent. There is also something deeply Australian about the way Rawlinna works. The romance of the place is real, but it is built on logistics. Fences, water, freight, rail access, weather, sheep, distance. Everything depends on planning ahead, because once you are this far out, convenience stops being part of the equation. That is why Rawlinna lingers in the imagination. Not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it reveals what life looks like when scale itself becomes the challenge. So Rawlinna is more than a siding on a railway and more than a name on the Nullarbor. It is a reminder that in Australia, remoteness is not always a matter of emptiness. Sometimes it is a matter of sheer expanse. A few people, a rail line, a flock spread across an almost unimaginable distance. And beyond all of it, the quiet force of a landscape that seems to go on forever. Boulia, where the darkness starts to move. Some towns are remembered for what they built. Boulia is remembered for what people say they have seen. Set in Western Queensland, Boulia calls itself the land of the Min Min light. The local council says the region is home to a mysterious, unexplained ball of light that can follow cars and people for miles, then suddenly vanish. In other words, this is not the kind of place where the night feels empty. It feels watchful. That is what gives Boulia its unusual grip on the imagination. In most remote towns, darkness is just darkness. Here it comes with stories. Witnesses have described Min Min lights as floating, fast-moving balls of color that seem to stalk travelers across the outback. ABC reported that some scientific theories point to mirages caused by atmospheric conditions, while other explanations have ranged from distant headlights to natural gases, insects, birds, and older spiritual traditions that treat the lights as something far more meaningful than optics. For an American audience, that is part of what makes Boulia so compelling. It feels like a frontier town, but with a layer of myth still intact. Not myth in the fairy tale sense, myth in the older sense. The kind born in vast landscapes where silence, distance, and darkness are so absolute that the mind never feels completely separate from the land. And yet Boulia is not only about mystery, it is also about endurance, rhythm, and spectacle. Each year, the town comes alive for the Boulia camel races, which the Regional Tourism Board describes as Australia's richest camel race. The event is held every July, and the Better Beer Camel Cup is described as the longest camel race in Australia, run over 1,200 meters. For a place that can feel almost motionless the rest of the year, it becomes an outback burst of noise, red dust, cheers, and movement. That contrast matters because it tells you what Boulia really is. By day, it is a hard outback settlement shaped by distance. By night, it becomes a place of rumor, memory, and strange light on the horizon. And once a year, it turns into celebration, proof that even in some of the loneliest parts of Australia, people still create ceremony, excitement, and community from almost nothing. So Boulia is not just remote, it is the kind of place where reality never feels completely sealed off from legend. And maybe that is why towns like this endure, because in a landscape so wide and unforgiving, people do not survive on practicality alone. They also survive on stories. In the end, these places are more than remote towns on a map. They are proof of something older and tougher in the human spirit. Because even here, beyond comfort, beyond convenience, beyond almost everything we usually call normal, people still found a way to stay. And maybe that is the real story of the Outback, not just the size of the land, but the quiet strength of those who chose to live at its farthest edge.